There was a day when money quietly stopped being what we thought it was. No alarms rang. No riots broke out. No headlines announced the switch. You still went to work. Prices still had numbers. Your paycheck still arrived on time. And yet, something fundamental broke. Money stopped representing reality. It stopped being a claim on something real, scarce, and finished. It became a promise layered on top of another promise, backed by faith, enforced by law, and sustained by silence. Most people never notice because nothing collapsed overnight. That is how the most important changes always happen. Slowly, technically, quietly. Tonight, we are going to uncover when this happened, why it happened, who benefited, and why the consequences are still unfolding right now. This is not a story about greed. It is not a story about villains in dark rooms. It is a story about incentives, systems, and a moment when the definition of money changed forever. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Setting the stage. What money used to be for most of human history. Money had one defining characteristic. It was hard to fake. Shells were rare. Silver required labor. Gold demanded mining, refining, transport, and protection. Money represented stored effort. It was a receipt for work already done. If you held money, it meant someone else had produced something valuable and handed you a claim on that value. This limitation mattered. It enforced discipline. Kings could not simply create gold to fund wars. Empires had to tax, borrow honestly, or conquer. When they overspent, the consequences arrived quickly. Inflation was visible. Coins were clipped. Trust evaporated. Money was not perfect, but it was anchored. Then something changed. Not suddenly, not violently, but permanently. Origins. The first crack in reality, the first crack appeared when paper receipts began circulating as money. Originally, paper notes were not money. They were warehouse tickets. You deposited gold or silver and the note proved you could reclaim it later. The paper had value only because the metal existed somewhere else. This system worked as long as honesty held. But bankers noticed something. Most people never redeemed their notes at the same time, so banks began issuing more paper than metal. At first it was cautious, then profitable, then addictive. Fractional reserve banking was born. A system where money was no longer a thing, but a ratio. For every real unit held, many claims could exist. This was the first moment money began drifting from reality. But the anchor still existed. Gold was still there. Redemption was still possible. The illusion had boundaries, till those boundaries became inconvenient. The rise. Central banks in control as economies grew. Governments faced a recurring problem. Wars were expensive. Infrastructure was costly. Voters disliked taxes. Borrowing became the solution. Central banks emerged to manage debt, stabilize currencies, and act as lenders of last resort. In theory, they were neutral guardians. In practice, they became the engine of modern finance. Central banks standardized money creation. They coordinated interest rates. They backstopped banks when risk went wrong. They quietly normalized the idea that money could be created to solve problems. At first, it was temporary. Emergency measures, short-term liquidity. But emergencies kept happening. Every crisis justified a little more flexibility. Every downturn required a little more intervention. Money creation stopped being exceptional. It became routine. Still, the system pretended to be real. Gold was still referenced. Convertibility still existed. The illusion held until the day it did not. The breaking point. The day money stopped being real. That day came when money officially severed its final tie to anything tangible. When governments declared that paper currency would no longer be redeemable for gold or silver. When money stopped being a claim on reality and became a declaration of authority. From that moment on, money was no longer limited by nature. It was limited only by policy, confidence, and political will. This was the turning point. Because once money can be created without cost, it stops measuring value. It starts distorting it. Prices no longer reflect scarcity. They reflect liquidity. Savings stop representing security. They become targets. Debt stops being a burden. It becomes a strategy. And almost nobody noticed because life continued as usual. Cause and effect. What changed after the switch once money became abstract? Incentives flipped. Governments could spend today and push consequences into the future. Politicians could promise benefits without funding them honestly. Banks could expand credit far beyond deposits. Risk could be socialized. Losses could be rescued. Markets learned to expect intervention. Failure was no longer final. This created a feedback loop. Cheap money encouraged borrowing. Borrowing inflated asset prices. Rising prices justified more borrowing. Each cycle required more liquidity to sustain the illusion. Meanwhile, wages lagged behind. Why? Because asset inflation benefits those who already own assets. And newly created money flows first through financial institutions, not workers. By the time it reaches the public, prices have already adjusted. This is not accidental, it is structural. The fallout. Debt as the dominant product over time, debt replaced production as the primary driver of growth. Corporations borrowed to buy back shares instead of investing in productivity. Governments borrowed to fund obligations instead of reforming systems. Consumers borrowed to maintain living standards as real purchasing power eroded. Debt became the most profitable product in history. It's not because it created value, but because it extracted it predictably. Interest payments became permanent transfers from the future to the present. And the system depended on expansion, because if debt stopped growing, defaults would expose the illusion. This is why the system fears deflation more than inflation. Deflation reveals insolvency. Inflation hides it. Failed fixes. Why every solution made it worse. Every attempt to stabilize the system introduced new fragility. Lower interest rates encouraged leverage. Quantitative easing inflated assets, but not productivity. Bailouts preserved institutions, but destroyed accountability. Each fix delayed consequences, but increased scale. The system became too big to fail because it had been allowed to grow beyond reality. At no point did leaders stop and ask the uncomfortable question: what happens when confidence breaks? Because confidence is the only thing holding abstract money together. Modern parallels. The pattern repeats. Look around today. Record global debt levels. Persistent inflation despite tightening policies. Asset prices detached from fundamentals. Central banks trapped between inflation and collapse. The pattern is repeating because the cause was never addressed. Money is still unreal. It is still created faster than value. Debt still grows faster than income. And trust is stretched thinner with every cycle. Technology did not fix this. Digital money only accelerated it. The system became faster, not stronger. The psychological cost: when money stops being real, people change. Long-term planning disappears. Speculation replaces saving. Risk feels necessary, not optional. People chase assets not because they want wealth, but because they fear falling behind. This is not a moral failure. It is an adaptive response to distorted signals. When the measuring stick is broken, rational behavior looks irrational. The quiet truth, the most dangerous part, is not inflation or debt. It is normalization. A generation has grown up never knowing real money. They accept perpetual borrowing, endless intervention, and financial complexity as natural. But systems built on abstraction eventually collide with limits. Not suddenly, then all at once. 3 takeaways. First, money is a system of trust, not paper or code. When trust erodes, complexity collapses quickly. Second, debt is not growth. It is borrowed time. Borrowed time always runs out. Third, systems that hide consequences encourage behavior that guarantees them. Warning and open-ended thought: the day money stopped being real was not the end. It was the beginning of a long delay. We are living inside that delay right now. The question is not if the system changes. The question is who pays for the transition. Call to action: if this changed how you see money, share it with someone who still thinks prices. Tell the truth. Subscribe if you want to understand the systems shaping your future before they force you to learn the hard way. Because once money stops being real, understanding becomes the only real asset left.